Welcome to RISK66 Accelerated Training video on assumptions made by an actuary. I'm Tim Coomer. Let's get started. So what is an assumption? We define an assumption as an estimate of an uncertain variable input for predictive purposes. So an actuary is going to base their report on certain assumptions. The assumptions that are typically made during a loss projection and reserve analysis are what we're going to discuss in this video. The most fundamental assumptions deal with the data that the actuary receives and on which they perform their analytics. Probably the biggest assumptions are made with this data. There's an assumption that the client will have processed their data in a reasonable way. There's a general assumption that the data that is received by the actuaries is accurate. We assume that the clients have done the necessary due diligence and the process and procedures that they have in place to make sure the data is accurate on their end. We also assume that claims are being administered and adjusted in a reasonable way, although it is possible to have accurate data sent to us even though there may be issues with claims administration. Sigma also assumes that the adjusters are routinely reviewing the claims, making updates when necessary, properly reserving claims, consistently reserving the claims, and constantly monitoring the claims and making adjustments when needed. We assume that changes in claims administrators does not affect the analysis unless the data proves otherwise. The biggest assumptions actuaries make that might affect the reserves in the loss projection would be in the case where clients do not have unique development triangles or enough historical data. In this case, actuaries assume that industry patterns or benchmarks are reasonable to apply to the client situation. Note, there are not a lot of other choices. Example would be benchmark factors are often used for new lines of businesses. Let's look at assumptions as they relate to shorter tail lines. Assumptions made on what trends may be there or may not be there are probably mitigated because information is coming in so much faster than with the longer tail lines. Example would be auto physical damage or property. Most claims occur within 24 months and are settled, so not a lot of assumptions are made on how those claims are being adjusted. There's also more hard data that's going to be more readily available for these shorter tail lines. Now let's look at assumptions related to longer tail lines. For longer tail lines, actuaries have less confidence on what's actually going to happen to the claims. In the case of extreme conditions, such as occurrence policies for general liability that might involve pollution or environmental changes, that is asbestos or mold, actuaries are more open to the assumptions that this extraordinary class of things do or do not exist. In other words, the actuaries are going to assume historical patterns and trends apply until there's enough data to indicate that something is different, and then they will adjust accordingly. For low frequency and low severity lines of coverage, actuaries might make the assumption that the limited data does indicate what the severity and frequency might be and that it does have some predictive value. If that isn't the case, then frequency and severity information will have to be obtained elsewhere, such as industry benchmarks, and the assumption that these benchmarks are a good match to the data that we have in hand will apply. Let's look at a few other minor assumptions. It's assumed that trend factors are reasonable. It's assumed that the historical mix of business, particularly for loss projections, is consistent with the period being projected. And finally, it's assumed that historical patterns are indicative of future patterns. In conclusion, actuaries assume that data is correct and reasonably adjusted. The more data there are, the more the standard approaches are going to be used. The application of industry factors are reasonable for new lines of business or in the case where there is limited amount of data. Historical patterns and trends are indicative of the future. Actuaries typically do not anticipate that there's any extraordinary changes in the legal, social, or economic environment which might affect the frequency and cost of claims. For expanded information, see the resources listed along with this video or contact Sigma Actuarial Consulting Group at support@sigmaactuary.com. Thank you for taking time to watch this Assumptions Made by an Actuary accelerated training video from RISK66.